So good morning. Let me start by thanking Albert and Philip for Pip for inviting me to this conference. I've learned a lot in the last 2 days about things that I didn't know very much about, and I think Professor Seke hit it on the nail on the head, saying how pensions are actually much easier than what most of you are doing, and it is something I've known for a while that and avoided in some ways being too involved in health insurance and all these much more complicated things. But what my job, I think, here this morning is to give you a quick overview, and I want to emphasize that because it's going to cover many countries, it's going to have to be by definition sort of superficial, but we have some good, interesting case studies, and we'll have time to get into some details later in the conversation. So the basic approach to thinking about pensions for us is that pension systems have two objectives. They're there for consumption smoothing and also to alleviate poverty among the old. I'm not going to go on these things, but just to give us a little bit of a framework for looking at these pension systems in the region. We look at some key indicators of performance, and these are coverage, adequacy, and sustainability. And we'll go into those and specifically with different countries. And there are some indirect effects which we'll be talking about in the report, which I'm not going to be getting into now. And perhaps the most relevant for us in this conversation in the last few days has to do with the incentives for retirement and how pension systems often, aside from earnings tests, there are various ways that pension systems can be designed to promote or to reduce labor force participation rates at older ages. So I won't be talking about those things because we have very little time. There are different elements of pension systems, and we have certain terminology that we use. For some of you who aren't familiar with it, to define benefit schemes, I think most of you are familiar with the terms, involve a defined benefit relative to your wages that you get, whereas a defined contribution scheme involves accumulating money into an individual account, and you get what you accumulate with interest. And so this is a table that basically gives you a quick snapshot, which I'm not going to spend any time on, showing you there's a lot of heterogeneity in the region in terms of the different elements of the pension systems. And there are countries that have integrated civil service schemes with their main pension systems, and there are quite a few countries that have separate schemes for the civil servants. We don't have time, I think, to go into the details of each, and we also aren't going to go into the different parameters of all these schemes. There are contribution rates, retirement ages, indexation formula. I mean, we could spend a lot of hours comparing the details of each of the scheme, and it won't really get us very far in the time we have. So what I've tried to do is give you some stylized picture of what is happening in the region by grouping the countries a bit. And those of you who know these systems very well will immediately object that they're very different within those groups, and they are. But I think it's useful to think a little bit about the common issues that face different types of systems. So the first type of system, the group one, are defined contribution-based systems. And the Malaysian and Singapore cases are fairly, they're kind of outliers in the global scene. So very big mandated provident funds that have accumulated a lot of assets over time, and that is the main scheme in those countries. Indonesia, which we're going to hear more about from Mitch, has a defined contribution scheme, but it's actually in the process very soon of moving away from that model to what would be a hybrid defined benefit, defined contribution scheme. Now, in the second group, we have the pay-as-you-go, or you could also say partially funded in many cases, defined benefit schemes. These are the mandated national schemes which are for consumption smoothing. Okay, and in some cases there is redistribution, but this is the main element of a pension system that is providing the consumption smoothing function. So you have, I've actually tried to do the color scheme that we were talking about earlier in terms of the countries, and you'll see that they don't neatly fit into these groups too much, except for the green countries, which are interesting because they don't have a mandatory national scheme. So there are civil service pensions in each of those countries, but those countries, and these, remember, were the young lower income These countries do not have mandated national schemes, but several of them are in the process of planning to introduce them, namely Laos and Myanmar. But in the group 2, you have another important distinction is between sort of recently initiated schemes and those schemes that are already mature. So if you think Thailand, Vietnam, and Korea are relatively recent pay-as-you-go defined benefit schemes that have been introduced. Korea in '88, Vietnam effectively in '95, and similarly in Thailand. The other schemes, the China, Japan, the Philippines, these are mature schemes, and so they've been around a longer time, so people are now retiring with full benefits from those schemes, and that's reflected in the data that we're going to look at. The asterisks there, I think there's refer to coverage. So if you've got 2 asterisks, I'm considering it a high coverage country. We'll go into the actual numbers, but just to give a stylized picture of what it looks like. Obviously, coverage is low if you don't have any mandated scheme. I mean, we do count the civil servants in the coverage, but it's very small. And then in other countries, as we'll see, there is moderate coverage in some, and in some it's quite universal. Just a few other details. The Mongolians are transitioning to what we call a notional defined contribution scheme. Without getting into the details of that, what it essentially is it's a pay-as-you-go scheme that mimics defined contributions, and so has individual accounts. And some people feel that that has certain advantages over the traditional defined benefit scheme. And of course, China has not so recently, but has introduced individual accounts. These are defined contribution accounts on top of a pay-as-you-go defined benefit, and we'll hear more about it from Dylan, so I won't go into it, but the question of how real these accounts are often is a subject of discussion. So in group 1, by definition, they're not really concerned about sustainability because the assets equal the liabilities of these defined contribution schemes, so it's not a big issue for them. Their concern really is on adequacy, and this depends, the adequacy of a defined contribution scheme will depend on 2 parameters that they set that are policy choices, and one which is a variable that has to do with your performance, and particularly in investment. And those parameters are contribution rate, so if you have a low contribution rate and you're basically depending on accumulating your own savings, then it's not going to be, you're not going to accumulate very much, and therefore you're going to have an inadequate pension, perhaps. And if the retirement age is too low, then if you accumulate your savings and you have to then use that savings to live for a very long time at the end, then it may not be sufficient. And then the other question is, what is the rate of return on those investments? And the important relationship is the rate of return compared to your wage growth. So it's all fine if you have a 3% rate of return or a 4% rate of return over inflation, but if wages are growing faster than that, then over a very long period of time, you'll find that what you're able to replace and the replacement rate that you're able to generate out of the pension is going to be low. And that's exactly what has happened particularly in Singapore, but in both you have the return, which is specified in these cases. So in the case of Singapore, say 2.5%, over a very long period of time was lower than the actual growth of the incomes and wages. And so as a result, because of that negative differential, what you could accumulate was not sufficient to convert into an annuity that was provided you with a high replacement rate. Now that was one problem. Another, though, is that life expectancies were increasing. So unless you were raising the retirement age along with life expectancy, you're going to end up generating a low potential annuity from that system. In Indonesia, you have a fairly low contribution rate, which doesn't generate very high accumulations. Mitch will talk about what's happening there. And Hong Kong is a very special case. It's the one in the region that uses the private sector and which has competing private pension funds with defined contribution accounts. It has a very low cap, And there's a lot of variation in the results, and it's been 14 years now that it's been running. I talked to people in the industry and in the regulator, and there are some complaints about how variable the returns are and of costs. And a big issue for all of those type of systems where you have private pension competing elements is the question of cost, because the costs then reduce the net rate of return, because what matters is not just the investment return, but the investment return after your fees. And none of these really provide any way of having effective longevity insurance. So in the second group, we do have concerns over sustainability. And because typically the parameters of the scheme, the contribution rate and the benefit levels, the benefit formula, were not set up in a way to be in actuarial balance. So right from the beginning, you've set up a system where you can expect that you will not be able to continue indefinitely in that way. And if we look at when the cash flow deficits are going to happen, already mature schemes, and the Mongolians are sort of a special case, but they already are running cash flow deficits and require budget transfers. In Korea, they made changes several times which have extended the life of the fund, but still within the period of relevance, you're still going to end up having cash flow deficits. Now, you may have reserves, and there's a question as to whether those reserves are really a real buffer against these cash flow deficits. If they're really invested somewhere, not just in, say, government bonds, where you're essentially owing yourself the money, then perhaps they do help you extend the life of the scheme. But eventually, all of these pay-as-you-go schemes end up running into deficits as the population ages. And China is, I think, and maybe Stuart can say something about this, it's quite notable that there aren't good numbers on such an important country's pay-as-you-go pension system. I think it's something that should be remedied, but it has big implications, not just for China, but for the world. And so most of these programs, oh, and by the way, the figure here is from the ADB, and they've calculated the contribution rate that would be required in these countries to have an actually balanced system. And as you can see, they're much higher than the actual contribution rates are in these countries. So that's just one way of without doing a projection, just looking at the parameters of the system and saying, this is not, by intrinsically, is not in balance. Most of these systems need some kind of parametric reforms. They're kind of the usual laundry list that we have. Raise the retirement age and link it to life expectancy, apply actuarially fair adjustments so that you don't penalize people for working longer, these earnings tests, and move from final salary schemes to an extended earnings base, et cetera. So in some cases, indexation may be an issue. For each country, you look at it and see, well, what kind of changes are really necessary, but they all kind of fall into this category of parametric reforms of the existing system. Now, I want to show you a few cross-country figures here. So this is the relationship between pension spending as a share of GDP and the share of the population that's over 60. And you can see it's not a very tight fit, but there's a definite correlation. And it tells you, first of all, that there are policy differences and policy choices. Just because you've got 30% of the population over age 60 doesn't mean you're going to spend 10% of GDP. The outlier up there at the top is Ukraine, which obviously, for whatever reason, is spending much more than other countries at the same demographic stage. The countries that are colored here, and again, I was trying to refer back to this color scheme that we were using. So these are the low-income countries. So Myanmar, Laos, these countries have very low coverage because you're only talking about spending, because you're only talking about spending on civil service pension schemes. And this is Mongolia here, and Mongolia is sort of a post-Soviet kind of a society which has higher coverage than other countries at that income level. It's actually very similar in some ways to the transition socialist economies that we see in Eastern Europe. So they're kind of an outlier. But in general, what you can see is that the spending for a given level of aging is lower in this region than in others. So, I mean, Hong Kong is kind of the extreme case, where they're basically, the only spending that they do is really on the small social assistance program for the elderly. This is a privately managed funded scheme, so that they spend very little. That's Japan. And it's interesting, when you look back at this book that we put out in 1994, and at the time, there was no country as old as Japan is today. And we had done this similar figure 20 years ago. And if you went by that figure and you put Japan's demography on that line, they should be spending something like 16, 17% of GDP based on the old relationship between spending and demography. But in fact, not only Japan, but many of the OECD countries have instituted reforms that have actually shifted this line downwards. And so if we tried to project 20 years ago what would be the situation today, we would have been wrong. We would have been overestimating the spending because of all these reforms that have happened in these countries. But the message here is that East Asian countries are generally spending less for the same demography than other countries around the world. In some cases, this is because they're immature schemes. So Korea is, I think, here, and that's going to change when that scheme matures. That scheme was set up in 1988, so the first people that are going to retire with full benefits are going to retire in 2028. So it's deceptive, the fact that they're spending less now because it's an immature scheme. The same goes for Thailand to a lesser extent, and Vietnam will also increase quite a lot. But for some of the countries, the reason is that they just simply don't have a mandated national scheme. So they're not spending anything because they don't really have anything. So group 3, those green countries, the Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Timor-Leste, they do have issues of sustainability. These countries have low tax bases to begin with. So even though they may not be spending much on their civil service pension scheme, it can strain their public finances. And so a number of them are looking to reform their civil service schemes. And several of them, as you saw, have already passed legislation which will introduce a new mandated national scheme. But in these countries, the formal sector is going to be less than 10% of the labor force. So setting up a national pension scheme, a new defined benefit scheme for these folks, it's questionable why you're doing this for such a small part of the population. And they tend to do it without integrating it with the civil service scheme, which is also problematic. You're now creating 2 small parallel defined benefit schemes in the country. You have low capacity to administer these programs to begin with. The record keeping is very, very poor, and the human resources are very limited. And inevitably, when you set one of these schemes up, and this is part of the temptation of doing it, is that in the early days, it's immature, so you're getting more contribution revenues coming in than you are paying out benefits. So you amass reserves, and this is something which is very tempting in the early days, is to have this nice pot of money that's growing in an immature pension scheme, but they have very little capacity to actually manage that money effectively. And so my question is, are they going to kind of repeat the mistakes of the past and so many countries that we've seen that have done exactly this? And it seems that that's the way things are moving. So the other side of this, so when we look at this question of the mandated national scheme, we're really talking about the top part of the income distribution. So when we think about adequacy and redistribution and poverty among the elderly, you're really not talking about those people with those contributory schemes, unless you're in Japan or perhaps Korea, but where you have very high coverage. You need to look at what are the other mechanisms for alleviating poverty among the elderly. In OECD countries, it may be a minimum pension within the scheme, but the minimum pension doesn't apply to the vast majority of people in these countries. So we have to look at non-contributory or social pensions. And the countries, in that sense, fall into these three groups. The group that has nothing whatsoever, no social pension at all, social pensions with marginal coverage, and social pensions with broad coverage. And the biggest one in terms of coverage would be Timor, followed closely by Thailand. In Timor, it's a universal benefit. In Thailand, it's getting close to being universal, as you know. And then there's a very interesting and exotic Chinese case, which we'll hear more about. And if we look at coverage in global perspective, again, not surprisingly, you've still got the Laos and Myanmar's, Cambodia's with very, very low coverage relative to their income level. So this is a fitted line of the ratio of contributors to the working age population to the income per capita, the PPP adjusted income per capita. And it's a pretty tight fit across the world. And you see again the countries in the region that they're below the line in these countries because they have no national mandated scheme. As soon as they do, they'll jump up to the line. They'll basically be on the line because they'll get another 5% of the labor force in. And then you've got people close to the line or around it. But it's the most interesting story perhaps is the Chinese story, because so China's here before the recent expansion of coverage, and now with the recent expansion of coverage, they're that yellow triangle up there. So if you now add in all those rural pension people, you jumped way above the line, and it's a sort of unprecedented increase in coverage, both in absolute numbers and in terms of the relationship of a country at that income level having such high coverage. Okay. Now, I brought this because I wanted to make the point that this relationship between income per capita and coverage has been changing over time. When we did this the first time 20 years ago, the relationship was defined by this line here. Then what we did was recently updated that. So I used the same sample of countries and did the same fit, and this was the line. And then we have an expanded sample with many more countries, and that would give you this line. But either one of those lines is lower than the original line that we saw. And so what it says to me is that it's actually becoming more difficult to get people covered in contributory pension schemes at a given income level. So it's certainly not getting easier. And what it means is that if you're really going to depend on a contributory pension scheme as a main element for your pension system, you're going to have to wait a long time before you've got a high coverage in these countries, if it continues to hold this pattern. So a country like Myanmar may start out with 10% of the labor force covered. It may take 50 years to get to the income levels and the formal sector participation rates that give you high coverage. So it's not any kind of short-term answer to the question of old age income security in these countries. And even if the contributory scheme coverage doubled tomorrow or went to become universal tomorrow, you have to wait for it to accumulate. It takes 30, 40 years for that system to mature. So it's still not going to yield you any kind of income security for the elderly anytime soon. So there are significant limits in what I look at as a race between, in this region in particular, a race between an aging process that's happening at an unprecedented rate and the desire to have people in a pension system so that they can have some income replacement at the end of the day. And I don't think you win that race, and that's kind of a main message, that nobody's actually going to be able to win that race. So what's your alternative? And the alternative is, and John and Eduardo, you'll like this message, it's the social pensions. And what we're seeing, what I'm showing here is the relative generosity of social pensions. This is what we call social pension wealth. So it takes into account not only the level of the benefit, but also how long you're going to receive it. So that's the generosity on that scale. This is the cost, which is the present value of these non-contributory pensions. And the size of the circle is proportional to the coverage of the elderly in those countries. So, a big, generous, expensive social pension would be a big circle over on that side. This was the situation roughly 10 to 15 years ago, based on the data that we have. But what has happened is in the last 10 years, there's been a real massive expansion of these type of programs. And this is the picture today. So back at that time in the last graph, neither Thailand nor Timor existed, these schemes. I haven't put the Chinese, we have to put the Chinese up there at some point. But that Latin America is probably the place where we see the most rapid expansion of these things. But the frustration with these low coverage rates in the contributory scheme is now leading people to say, we're going to have to rely on something else. We're not going to, it's been 50 years and we still can't get very high coverage rates in these systems. We're going to have to supplement it with something else. So there are, however, real issues with social pensions. And we have ourselves in the World Bank a lot of internal debate about their proper role, and we debate it with guys in HelpAge and so on. But we see that it has a role, but there are questions as to how it fits into the overall system and what the trade-offs are. So if you're in a poor country, there are other needs that will, that occupy the limited budgets that you have, and the question is whether there are trade-offs that need to be made to finance a social pension scheme. There are countries that have fairly large social assistance programs. You could rely on that, but in this region, only I would say Philippines and Indonesia would perhaps fit into that category where you have these big conditional cash transfer programs that would effectively cover the poor elderly because the elderly live in those households. But those are the exceptions in the region. And even then, you're really talking about the bottom quintile. So it's not a complete picture. And then there's a question of the incentives. And I've actually had discussions with people here in Hong Kong about the concern that people, if they expand the social pension and they subject that to a means test, then there'll be less incentive to participate and contribute into the contributory scheme. And that's a generic problem that we look at in many countries. I mentioned the case of subsidized health insurance because there are many more subsidized health insurance schemes around the world where they're facing that issue. I can actually get health insurance without being in the formal sector, therefore there may be an incentive to stay in the informal sector. And then there's the question of adequacy and sustainability, the trade-off between adequacy and sustainability. The Timor scheme is fairly generous and very universal, and it's somewhat expensive. And I actually didn't show that. You may have wondered. So there's Timor. So why is Timor they haven't even started spending money on their civil service pension scheme, much less any national scheme, which they don't have. This is all social pension. So they've made a choice to spend a lot of money on the social pension. But in the case of China and Thailand, these are very, very small benefits relative to incomes in the country. So although they may get pretty high coverage, these are small benefits, and there's going to be a trade-off there. Either they're going to make them more adequate, so they play a more substantial role, or and in which case they're going to become more expensive. And then, so just to conclude, the Group 1 countries, as I said, don't really have the coverage or sustainability problems now that Indonesia is moving out of that group, but they do have issues with adequacy. And Singapore is one of those cases where there's just nothing underneath the Central Provident Fund system to provide that kind of floor. So it strikes me that there are some serious adequacy issues as those countries are really aging fast. Indonesia is about to go into this second group, and that group is concerned with sustainability and coverage. And then Group 3 are these countries that don't even have the national scheme, and they're at a crossroads. And as I say, they may be about to make some of the mistakes that many other countries have made in the past, in my view, and maybe that's something we can argue about. And the greens and the purples they're losing the race between coverage and aging. So for the most part, the rich countries in the region have high coverage, and so it's a matter of how do you change that system at the margins, perhaps. But the rest of the region has low or moderate coverage, and they're going to age very quickly. And people are not going to be in the contributory pension system fast enough to depend on it to provide old age income security, so something else is going to happen. And my guess is that there's going to have to be a more substantial role for non-contributory and social pensions. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, I should stay.
Fascinating. We'll take two questions, one after the other, and then we go for coffee break.
Thanks for that presentation. The slide where you showed that coverage is becoming harder with increasing the three curves that go up.
Yeah.
Can you expand a bit on that, please, where that is? I'm wondering if there are parallels with the health sector, where we find that covering the informal sector, expanding coverage, is harder in this sort of decade or from time to say Japan, Korea, Taiwan's experience in the 60s and 70s. That's one question. The other one was about part-time work, which is like in Japan, for instance, can be a lot more part-time work, particularly in research. I was wondering what that meant for these pensions coverage.
Okay, on the first question, I don't think anybody knows why this is changing. There are some ideas that there's a change in the economic structure away from larger employers to smaller employers. I personally think that there may be some effect of countries having social security systems that now have high contribution rates. So the tax wedge for the formal sector has increased over time. I can't prove this, but I can prove that the tax wedge has increased, but I can't prove that that has led to more. There's some empirical evidence, but so if you've actually made becoming a formal sector worker or hiring a formal sector worker that much more expensive than it was 20 or 30 years ago, then that should be contributing to the lack of formalization of the workforce. So on the question of part-time work, I think that it has become a concern. Somebody was asking me, well, what's the definition of informal sector? And in rich countries, it's your idea of a self-employed person who doesn't report his earnings as a taxi driver, maybe a small proportion of the labor force, and you care about that because you want those people to have pension savings. But I'm used to thinking about the informal sector in what I call a 90-10 country, where it's 90% of the labor force, but it's a very heterogeneous informal sector in the low-income countries. But yeah, people are concerned about the part-time work reducing effective pension coverage. And I think you'll end up with a similar need for having something supplementing those contributory pensions.
I think we have to leave it now.